Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the State of Financial Services in the Cloud. This session is going to be a preview of an upcoming research report on the financial service industry, and also based on the survey we conducted this fall and some interviews. Today, we're going to cover what the results of that survey actually were. But before we jump into those results, I first want to bring on and introduce two of the experts that were contributors both to the survey and to the upcoming report. And we'll start with you, Hillary, if you can just introduce yourself and maybe part of your role of having this published later this month.
Awesome. Yeah, so I'm Hillary Barron. I'm the Senior Research Technical Director. So I help manage a lot of the research projects that come out of the working groups in particular, but I also help lead a lot of the survey and more ad hoc research that we're doing both with members as well as with our working groups. I have a background in evaluation research, so it's kind of my bread and butter.
And Craig, how about yourself?
Thanks, Troy. Yeah, so I'm Craig Boarding, about 30 years as a security practitioner. My contribution is really in terms of the last few years has been working closely with our financial services members, understanding their cloud journeys, and then in this survey, helping formulate questions as I did for the previous one and the analysis around that.
Yeah, very good. And for a quick introduction for myself, Troy Leach, Chief Strategy Officer for the CSA. My role is to help look at short and long-term strategies for how we can effectively develop new opportunities and initiatives, education and research for the industry, and in particular industry sectors. And for this, we are looking specifically at financial services. And if we start to look at the methodology for this report and how it all began, really, the origins come from a few different sources. First, we were seeing that the financial service entities, this is fintechs, this is banking, this is those that are SaaS providers and other CSPs supporting financial service entities. We see crypto exchanges, insurance organizations, the list goes on fairly lengthily. And what we see is that they were asking for additional help, specifically in how can we demonstrate and have use cases or examples of managing multi-cloud instances? How do we go from some of these on-premise security best practices to really successfully not only feeling and confident in the security in a cloud, but also can demonstrate that to whether it's regulators or other third parties. And then we just recognize that the industry itself, based on where we were pre-pandemic to now, has really taken a massive adoption of cloud services. And we see that more than 2/3 of all banking entities now are using some type of cloud native or SaaS development of their new ways of accepting transactions or processing some form of financial data. We see that pre-pandemic, there was just a very small percentage of the actual sensitive data operating to where we are today. So we recognize that there was a need to take and look at the survey we conducted 3 years ago and the report that resulted from that, and find ways that we can improve upon those questions and really find some differentiation. And Craig, I'll stop there and ask you, because you are one of the few people that were involved in both reports and in both surveys. I'm just curious to get some quick takes on the similarities and differences that you saw.
Yeah, there's definitely a few similarities, particularly around using CSA material to help inform policy, as the various institutions have tried to wrap their arms around how they're going to manage the risks of cloud whilst gaining the reward. So I think that's a common theme that we still see. I think the other big difference is the number of regulated workloads that we now observe our members are actively deploying to cloud. So that is, on the one hand, positive, because by now, yeah, we should be confident in our ability to manage that risk. But perhaps, as we'll see, there's still some room for improvement.
Yeah, and so this paper is going to follow a very similar process to what you've seen in other types of CSA research outputs. We're going to have some analysis, some of that already done internally with Hillary and the rest of the research team and Craig and others. And then we're going to have an opportunity for our financial service leadership group and working group, anyone can participate in that, to have a view and be able to weigh in and opine on some of the findings that we had. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we're hoping for a Q1 publication for this report. Hillary, did I get that right? And if so, I'll turn it over to you to start looking at some of the results of the survey.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. So for survey methodology, the only thing that I'll add is that we did learn a little bit from our previous version where it was just a survey, and we wanted some additional context. So we did do a round of interviews as well, just to provide a little bit more, as I said, context to the numbers, but also just to make the information a little bit more robust in the report.
Good. So, and I'll just add to that as well. Just some of that was qualitative information from CISOs that covered many of the entities that we discussed before. People that were in senior leadership positions that were feeling the growth and pain points of having a financial entity that is having to meet regulation and other types of demands of the CISO and the GRC offices of these financial entities. Speaking of regulation, probably that's a good segue, Hillary, to our next slide on the first of our survey results.
So the first area of, well, there's really 5 areas that we keyed in on when it came to the survey results. And the first one that we really saw a lot of, and it really spreads throughout the themes, it's really interconnected, was around regulation. So the majority of FSIs are using cloud computing for regulated data. When we look at, whether they're currently doing or are planning to in the next few years, there's only 25% that have absolutely no plans. So regulation is, always a part of the financial services industry, but even more so when we're talking about the cloud. That's definitely something that we have to have our eye on, because the majority of banks, this is something that they're dealing with. When we did ask about the percentage of workloads, they tend to be that are regulated, they tend to be on the slightly lower end when it comes to public cloud services, with most people falling within with under 50%. So there is a migration towards regulated data being processed and stored in cloud. It's somewhat slow and plodding, so people are taking regulation into consideration, trying to think through every step, because we don't have a lot of room for error when we're talking about the financial services industry. When it does come to what are some of the blockers, regulation was often cited as the main reason that they couldn't or were having issues getting into cloud or processing more data in cloud. Data privacy was another one. And then another area that also came up was the skills gap, which I think is kind of hitting all industries. But again, we have to kind of come back to, regulation is a key part of this migration, particularly for this industry.
And just to add to that, in the opportunity for the respondents to weigh in on what regulation in particular, some of the more common items or frameworks that were mentioned was the NIST cybersecurity framework, PCI data security standard, ISO 27001, GDPR, the privacy, as Hillary mentioned. We saw FFIEC and their cybersecurity guidance, and other just regional laws. We see that there's a lot of data sovereignty, data localization laws that have either come into effect or being considered. What does that mean for using public clouds and that role? And the other part is just the education of regulators. In the interviews, we heard a lot about regulators asking specific questions that would have been relevant for another type of cloud platform, but not understanding that not all cloud platforms are the same, and how you go about validating and demonstrating the vernacular and everything associated does change with each provider. And so there's a need, they said, for further education and just training for those that are responsible for auditing and regulating against these platforms.
So the second key area that we really honed in on is really interconnected with regulation, and that's around data management in the cloud. So again, high impact with regulation, high interconnection there. Data really has to be protected at all phases, particularly in this industry. And there has to be that clear audit trail as well of the movement really at every step, whether it's at rest, in motion, in use, what have you. So when it comes to deploying sensitive workloads in the cloud, data privacy and requirements for compliance function were both within the top 3 items that, where they said these are really challenging for us. This is something that is not necessarily a blocker, but it is a barrier that they have to try and overcome in order to work within cloud. 50% of respondents said that they need to perform 6 or more regulatory audits with CSPs, which is incredibly time consuming again, and will serve as a constraint as well. That was asked in a separate question, but so it's not going to be displayed on the chart here, but definitely something that we want to keep in mind as well as a potential barrier. So really, and that's also really complicated by the fact that we have that skills gap. So again, impacting all industries, but certainly when we're talking about a highly regulated industry, this skills gap becomes even more profound. As I said, skills gap can cause a lot of potential issues for organizations regardless of that industry. But when we're talking about tired and stressed out staff that's already potentially skilled and may have that knowledge, you're also going to run into issues where they are creating more complications or potentially misconfigurations or other errors, which can cause problems in the long run when it comes to data management, and particularly when we're talking about those regulated workloads. So there's really not a lot of room for error, and that skills gap really does cause a lot of problems there. Craig, I don't know if you want to provide any additional color there.
Yeah, I think the 3 points I would make. One is that those sort of configuration issues, knowing that you've got your cloud environment configured as you anticipated it to be, that falls on both sides. So certainly from my experience working in banking, there could be errors, omissions within our own staff, or it could be actually on the CSP, their own in-house consultants. So having visibility over that configuration, knowing when you're going out of compliance, is really important. So I think it's still very sort of bullish for those third-party providers that continue to develop those services. I think the second point would just be around the privacy that you both touched on already. It's very challenging for global banks to operate cross-border depending on the particular workload, the actual data. And there's often a lot of need to go for external counsel around the interpretation around particular privacy things. So that hasn't gone away. There's actually a skills gap there. So, we talk about skills gap around operating the cloud. I still think that there is a challenge around getting timely, accurate, trustworthy, lawful advice around privacy. And it's not helped by some of the movements between EU, US, what's actually lawfully legitimate. And then I think the third thing, and we've seen a rise in this at CSA where there's been more interest in confidential computing. And I think that's going to unlock a lot more workloads that have sensitive data being able to process on someone else's computer, your CSP. So I'm actually think that's going to be a big growth area, and that's going to help the banks move more of their regulated workloads.
So another key area that we focused in on was the integrity of access to the cloud. So, with financial organizations, they have a lot of expectation for the integrity of who has access, having records of that access, of anyone that might be able to manipulate the accounts or be able to view any private information. So again, kind of coming back to a lot of that a lot of those regulations. So it's notable that zero trust was really a popular topic for those who took the survey. 72% said that they were looking for specific information for financial services when it comes to zero trust. Some other areas related to integrity of access, key management was a key area that we had a lot of, there was a lot of focus on. So, and particularly within key management, looking at HSM as a service. So it's being used by 33% of organizations for their regulated workloads, and for 4%, they're using it on their non-regulated workloads as well. So with key management, there is the high rates of use of cloud HSM as well. So that's where the key is stored in HSM, and CSPs don't have access to the key. So that's about 52% were using that specific version of it. And then we're also looking at a lot of on-premise still key management for critical workloads, and that was at about a rate of 38%. So this interest in HSM as a service was something that we noted within our key management working group, our cloud key management working group at CSA, and they're actually building an initiative focused around HSM as a service specifically to address that growing interest, and need for additional information. I think what's also interesting, on the last slide there, we did talk about confidential computing a little bit, and secure enclaves. So, and there being a high rate of interest in that, because of its ability to protect data. So it's being used by 29% of FSIs for regulated workloads, and 15% are using it for non-regulated workloads. So slightly higher on the non-regulated workloads, in particular over HSM as a service. So something of note there, and that's definitely a growing area and a growing trend that we've seen over the past couple of years. There's been a lot of interest in confidential computing, just broadly from the industry because of the capabilities. Beyond just integrity of access to the cloud, there's also some availability concerns that we wanted to highlight, because we saw that 43% of those surveyed were only using one CSP, and 52% don't have a backup plan. So this could really cause some problems from an auditing perspective, because if we only have a single CSP and there's any issues, if it goes down, or if there's just other issues, we could have some major problems for those folks, where they may end up trapped, particularly without that proper backup plan.
Yes, I think the concentration risk that you point out is really important here. 10 years ago, regulators were sending around questions to the regulated entities asking around, which cloud service providers are you using. They were trying to get a handle on what would happen to systemically important institutions if one of the major CSPs was to actually go down in some serious outage. And what's interesting to me is that we haven't really seen any new big CSPs arrive. We've still got the same major titans, the tech titans, but there's more and more being processed in cloud. So I'm curious to see, is there going to be any future regulation around sort of trying to constrain, which the regulators can't technically do that, but kind of try to constrain how much of certain regulated workloads are in certain cloud providers or sovereignty issues. So I think that's going to be an interesting space, particularly with the hyperscale technology companies facing more and more interest from US government and others. So I think that whole space is one to watch. Let's put it that way. Cloud HSM. I mean, look at the numbers. The numbers don't lie. This is how you get sort of sensitive workloads processed in cloud if you're a bank. So without cloud HSM, it would be a tough ask. You'd have ancillary workloads only. And I remember years back having conversations with cloud providers who were saying, we have banks that are processing really sensitive workloads in the cloud. You should put your workloads there. And of course, when you spoke to the other banks, you found out, well, it wasn't that sensitive. It was sort of side systems. But now it's true. Now it's really true. And actually the numbers, going up slowly, but I think that will continue. And I think that means that a lot of banks can finally really shrink their on-premise footprints. They're still going to keep some stuff in-house, but you go back and you look at how many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, did banks spend on in-house HSM, secure rooms, all the procedures, teams to support that, to develop it, to operate it, all kinds of procedures in place. Well, where's the talent going? The talent slowly moves from there into the CSPs. So it's another one to watch. Perhaps in 5 years' time, there'll be fewer banks with in-house HSMs.
Another key area that we honed in on was threat intelligence in the cloud. And this really came out in a couple of interesting ways. Certainly there's always interest in threat intelligence so that we can better protect ourselves from the kind of the latest trends or the latest threats. One way that it came out, there was a high rate of interest in the countermeasures, so something like zero trust. But there was also a lot of interest in training around specific threats like phishing, as well as like current trends. So if there's new threats or common attacks like supply chain attacks that we saw last year, looking at getting training on those potential threats and those specific threats. There was more that came out in the interview data. So Troy, I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's right, Hillary. Some of the conversations that we had was around the information sharing, recognizing that of different industry sectors, financial services does have several mechanisms already. They cited FSISAC, work with MITRE, several different organizations that have an ability to disclose in confidential ways some of the risks that they're seeing in real time. However, having said that, there was still a recognition of areas of, especially the cloud, how long the process is to enumerate new vulnerabilities by the CVE, and just an ask if there's opportunity for CSA to partner with some of these industry leaders to do cloud-centric threats, possibly do it by industry sector. If there are certain types of cloud vulnerabilities that are in financial apps, for example, and way that can the industry and the community come together and just enhance the already existing communication and sharing of vulnerabilities by possibly a global security database. I know that's one of the research areas that we've been working on. So they have a keen interest to see, can we take what we've learned and just enhance that for cloud vulnerabilities? Because even though we can scale very quickly, the frequency and pace of vulnerabilities in that same space also the speed is critical to be reactive to those types of threats, and that was a big ask in the interviews.
So in our final key area that we really picked up on was risk management in the cloud. And again, this is one of those things that it applies to all industries. In fact, we had a whole survey report about it that we put out last year, and we're actually doing it again this year. So this isn't FSI specific. There are every industry is kind of struggling with figuring out what to measure, how to measure it, putting it in context. What do the numbers mean? So this isn't something that is just unique to FSIs, but certainly is made even more challenging given that we're in such a regulated industry here. And there appears to be this kind of trend where there's a bit of disconnect between when we're talking about risk when it comes to the cloud versus when we're talking about other areas. So in this particular instance, when we were talking about the results from the survey, there were issues with integrating the cloud service risk assessments with their overall methodology. Most people, most respondents, so 68% were saying we're only partially integrated. So we're not getting that comprehensive or cohesive look. The other thing of note too, when we're talking about the cloud, we're also talking about a high rate of changes which are initiated by our service providers. And 91% are saying we have high or moderate levels of concern about this because it does change. It does change things for those of us that are using it, whether or not we're notified properly or feel like we have a good handle on what these changes are. They're happening regardless. So that's definitely something that definitely contributes to this kind of confusion and struggle when it comes to risk management in the cloud. Craig, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about risk management in the cloud or anything that I've brought up so far.
Sure. So I think the velocity of change by cloud service providers is on the one hand a great strength because they're able to make those incremental changes at pace, which we see, which banks are familiar with through their own CI/CD pipelines to push products and features faster to market. But of course, in a regulated context, it becomes somewhat tricky because as the regulated entity will need to sort of show evidence of how they are managing the risk of change. And obviously there'll be a bunch of changes going on sort of underneath the bonnet, as it were. And then there'll be those changes which are surfaced through the CSP specific change logs, which they publish. The challenge is that getting that information to the right person at the right time, making sure it's feeding through the right risk groups. And it can't follow a traditional path where, you'd have perhaps an architecture change meeting every 2 weeks. This is faster. This needs to be, in one way, a lighter touch, but it needs to be transparent. So I think that's one of the struggles that you've highlighted on from these results. And then I think the other piece is just around the way that banks are doing cloud risk assessments. In the beginning, it was very much, we don't know how to think about this. We have this risk model. Perhaps we have thousands of people in our risk department. They're looking at credit risk, operational risk, fraud risk, all sorts of risks. Now we have this cloud risk. Do we want to put that under, say, cyber risk? And well, cyber risk is still relatively new in terms of risk management terms. So I think what we've seen there is this usual sort of, okay, we'll have a separate team that will be cross-functional, pulled together, and we'll call that the cloud risk management team. And then they will sort of provide a summary of their assessment into our sort of broader risk side of the house, and they handle it that way. What does that mean? That means that there's still people warming up to what cloud is, still trying to understand what it means, still trying to think of it properly in terms of what does it mean from a risk perspective. But I think, the leaders have already well integrated that by now. It's not new. But what's interesting, I think, in terms of contrast is we actually had more respondents this time saying they're partially integrated than they were last time around fully integrated. So there's an interesting thing, which I think, we had some more respondents this time. But it also shows that just because you're managing your cloud risk one way 2 years ago, maybe you need to be managing that slightly different now because of the nature of the workloads that you're able to deploy. So I think that's an interesting tell. It shows that risk management doesn't stay the same.
So taking all these themes that Hillary and Craig and I spoke about, we're looking at CSA. What can we do to help address some of these areas? And really I identified for our roadmap four things. One, continue to do what we do and do it well. So we have so much research and activities around our framework that meet the needs of fintech, crypto exchanges, cloud service providers, and payment processors and banks, so forth. And that comes with our STAR program, the use of an addendum to our cloud control matrix, all these activities that we're already doing. But we also want to expand and find ways that we can create some collateral that is very centric to the specific regulatory and data management needs of financial services. And from there, the biggest thing is really to grow awareness, to expand to organizations and entities that are just not familiar with CSA and all the activities and opportunities for research within this great organization. And then finally, find ways to get more and broader participation. Craig just mentioned that we had a larger number of respondents to this survey. The more people that we can get involved, the greater focus we can have and on that lens of what we need to address within financial services. So to give you an example of what that looks like, we see that there are really, and from my perspective, 4 tenets that CSA does really well. And that is to educate on cloud security best practices and emerging threats, to look at how we go about security and applying those best practices, then empowering CISOs, other business leaders on their decisions of operating and the shared security responsibility with their cloud service providers, and the assurance for whether it's regulators or third parties or just simply senior leadership and governance within the organization. How do we provide demonstrative levels of confidence that we're actually achieving all this security best practices I just mentioned? So I'll go into just a couple of quick examples and then we'll turn over to final thoughts. For me, within the education, I think this financial service report that we've been discussing is one example of where we hope to have industry-centric opportunities to look at not just the cloud security landscape, but look at specifically how is this impacting players and participants within the certain communities. The second is around the security. We mentioned it earlier, but I think it's worth noting because it's just begun, is work in our research key management working group, and specifically on HSM as a service. We have more than a dozen organizations that have already volunteered to contribute. So this work has just started. Encourage you to look on Circle, on CSA's website, to find out more information and get involved if you have a keen interest there. For empowerment, I mentioned the shared security responsibility model. We'll be having some more collateral coming out that is general on the CSA STAR program and CCM and understanding that, but then also most likely centric to financial services and how you can map to certain regulatory frameworks and some of those obligations. And then within that assurance, also looking at the STAR registry, and are there more specifics? We mentioned a financial service addendum, the cloud control matrix. That would be one thing. And then finally, just on assurance, not just for externally, but also for CSA and assuring that we're doing the right things. We are looking to reorganize our existing financial service working group to be a more advisory board for all of these activities that have key relevance for financial services. In addition, we are going to have a financial service leadership council. This will be a strategic steering committee that helps to monitor the activities we're focusing on and help to address new areas that we may not have thought of previously. So a lot of upcoming financial service initiatives. I think there's over 24 that we've identified. And as the year progresses, we'll be talking more about those, including within our FinCloud Fridays, which is something that we are doing monthly, about webinars of all of this type of upcoming FSI initiatives from CSA, but also from the industry itself. Some of the things that industry is working on that we would think are relevant to our audience. Thank you, everyone, for hearing about this upcoming financial service report and some of the key findings from our survey and interviews. Before we leave, I just ask our 2 experts to provide maybe one final thought, something that stood out to you in this work that we've done.
So I think for me, probably the biggest standout is that the percentage of business critical workloads in production at CSP, at public CSP providers, is 8 times what it was when we originally took the survey. So that standout. And then to my earlier comment, will confidential computing mean that number is much bigger?
I think on my side, what makes me excited about this report over our previous version is we do have that interview data. So we've seen a little bit of an evolution with what we're able to say and the conclusions that we can come to and provide that additional context around the numbers. The previous version was very much, this is where we're at. This is what cloud adoption for FSIs looks like. So definitely this, the survey has a lot more to say this year. And we have seen an increase in participation, which is great, particularly because it does directly impact what we're doing, not only in our financial services specific working group, but also what we're doing outside of that group. So like I said, we have that HSM initiative. We're talking about the global security database. So there's other initiatives within CSA that are that we're definitely paying attention to and keeping an eye on and making sure that we have that financial services spin to things too, because it is so important to folks in the industry.
Yeah, and I'd probably just echo that as my final point, or related to the participation. We had a lot of new types of entities that are just becoming familiar with financial services for CSA. In those interviews, we had payment facilitators, people that are really SaaS developers that are just entering the space. We had more regulators and others that are looking at this with new perspective. And so that's great, but it still means that there's opportunity for us to grow that participation, really teach and explain where they can contribute, and look to see where we continue to grow the opportunities within CSA. So with that, we want to thank everyone for your time. You'll see that all of our emails are listed below. We're available throughout this summit to have contacted and chat, and feel free to reach out at any time about these. We do have on I mentioned earlier, our Circle website. Please look on there for all of the updates to our financial service working group and the changes I mentioned previously. With that, I hope you enjoyed the rest of today and look forward to hearing from you.